Thank you. I'm going to talk today about smart contracts and their use in conjunction with bug bounties. My presumption is that not everyone here is familiar with smart contracts, at least not intimately familiar. So I'm going to start with like a 2-minute tutorial on smart contracts. I'll explain what a smart contract is without getting into details. In a nutshell, a smart contract is a program that runs on a blockchain. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about blockchains, but I'll say that given trust in the blockchain on which a smart contract runs, you get a few important properties. The first is that smart contracts are transparent, by which I mean that their code and their execution, their behavior, are visible to the whole world. Everything is globally perceptible, as it were. A second essential property is that they're irreversible. Even the creator of the smart contract, and even a fairly powerful adversary, can't undo state changes made by a smart contract. It just keeps running. The third important property, and as you'll see, this is a really essential one, is that smart contracts are tamper-resistant. By this, I mean that, again, even a moderately powerful adversary, even the creator of the smart contract, cannot change its code or control flow once the thing has been launched on a blockchain. These are the important properties to keep in mind. Smart contracts also have a very nice feature, which is that in contrast to other forms of software, they can operate directly on money in the form of cryptocurrency or crypto tokens, which I'll talk about. The most popular public platform for smart contract execution is known as Ethereum. And there's been a huge amount of interest recently in Ethereum. Give you some sense of the degree of interest, you can take a look at one representative statistic, namely its market capitalization. Ethereum, as of this morning, things are highly volatile. This may have changed. It could have gone to 100, could have gone to 0 in the meantime. But at least as of this morning, the market capitalization was on the order of 50 billion. Since most of you are academics, I thought a natural point of comparison would be with, say, the endowments of the wealthiest universities in the world. And here they are, Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. Even Harvard, the wealthiest university in the world, has an endowment that is significantly smaller than the market capitalization of Ethereum. So Ethereum is worth more than any university in the world, and worth significantly more than, say, your sort of garden variety Ivy like the one I work at. Right? It's worth more than a factor of 7 times the endowment of Cornell. So this is just to give you some sense of how much interest the community has evinced in this very interesting system. Why are people so interested in Ethereum? Let me give you some sense of the things that Ethereum and smart contracts in general can do. As an example, suppose that Bob has created a new cryptocurrency, in particular a token. I'll explain later what a token is. Call it Bob's Bubble Token. And Alice would like to buy some Bob's Bubble Token. In particular, she's willing to spend 1 ether to buy 10 of these things. Well, Alice might be polite to Bob and say, Bob, please, you go first. We're going to make this trade. I'd like you to send your tokens to me, and then I will send my ether to you. Or, of course, the reverse could happen. Bob could be polite to Alice and say, you know, send your ether over, and then I'll send the tokens. But you can see that we've got a problem here. The first mover is at a disadvantage. And if Bob sends his bubble tokens over to Alice, he has no guarantee that Alice is going to pay him the ether, and vice versa. This is the classic problem of fair exchange. Ideally, what they would like to do is perform an atomic swap, where the exchange of both assets happens as a piece. Now, the assets are transferred simultaneously. Ideally, what Alice and Bob would like to be able to do is appeal to, say, a trusted third party, somebody whom everyone in the world trusts to behave in an honest and even and open-handed manner. In other words, what they really want is a kind of digital Oprah. Because if Oprah were available, this problem would be easy. Alice could send her ether to Oprah, Bob could send his bubble tokens, and then Oprah would fairly redistribute these assets. She'd send the ether to Bob, the bubble tokens to Alice, and we'd be done. We'd have a fair exchange effected. In this context, Oprah's behaving, as I said, like a trusted third party, and indeed, in this example, since we can see everything she's doing, she's behaving like a particular type of trusted third party, or TTP, one with public state. As all her behavior is visible to the world. Well, the problem, of course, is that Oprah is generally booked. So it's unlikely Alice and Bob are going to be able to invoke her help for this procedure. This is where smart contracts come into play. A smart contract, essentially, if you want a distilled down definition, a smart contract is like a trusted third party with public state. Again, its behavior is visible to the whole world. There's this property of transparency that I mentioned near the very beginning of the talk. Okay, now for something of an aside, can any sporting enthusiast tell me who this gentleman is? Floyd Mayweather. Well, actually, it's not Floyd Mayweather, although I understand the basis for your confusion. He renamed himself last summer. He is now Floyd Crypto Mayweather. Why is this? Well, Floyd Mayweather began to promote cryptocurrency, tokens in particular, or what are known as initial coin offerings. You can see the harvest he has reaped on the table there from pumping these things. And he's not the only celebrity doing this. Paris Hilton and various others have been involved. And there's been kind of a fervor over these ICOs, these token sales, and cryptocurrency in general, of course, as you're aware. So what is this asset that caused Floyd Mayweather to change his name? What exactly is a crypto token? You can think of a token as being like an application-specific cryptocurrency. Generally, these things take the form of what are known as ERC20 tokens. ERC20 just being a standard for token management in Ethereum smart contracts in particular. So these tokens are themselves managed in smart contracts. Their creation, their transfer, and so on and so forth are governed by these pieces of code. Tokens themselves, and again, the vast majority of these things are running on or managed by smart contracts in Ethereum. Tokens themselves, in the aggregate, have a market cap of something in the neighborhood of $40 billion. So they're worth almost as much as Ethereum itself. Tokens are sold in events that are often referred to as initial coin offerings, although those trying to evade regulation have tried to come up with other terms like token launch, token generation event, and so on and so forth. But they're all essentially referring to the same thing. You can think of these events, the sale of tokens, as being like a kind of unregulated venture capital investment, and often a crowd-funded one. A token in this sense is kind of like a share in a company, except it doesn't come with the stockholder rights that equity in a mainstream company typically comes with. The striking thing about ICOs is that since the middle of last summer, for almost a year now, the amount of money being poured into ICOs has outstripped that of conventional venture capital going into early-stage internet startups. This is, as you can imagine, a seismic event in the world of venture capital. And it continues apace. In fact, the amount of money flowing into ICOs has been steadily growing. If that's not crazy enough, there's a second type of token known as an ERC-721. The ERC-20s are fungible, which is to say that one ERC-20 token looks exactly like another ERC-20 token. ERC-721 tokens, on the other hand, represent non-fungible goods. They represent unique objects, potentially of great value, like houses and boats and works of art and digital cats. Well, the best known application of ERC-721 tokens is to a game called CryptoKitties, very popular briefly on Ethereum, a sort of Pokemon Go-like game, I guess. Well, Pokemon-like game, I should say. These digital cats can sell literally for tens of thousands of dollars. And in fact, since I've created this slide, at least one has sold for more than $100,000. So you can see that smart contracts have a lot of already demonstrated promise. Digital cats, ERC-20 tokens, and so on and so forth. But there's some real technical challenges to their achieving their full promise, to really achieving fruition. One of these, the one I'm going to focus on today, is the problem of correctness. As you'll see, smart contracts often have bugs. And these bugs, because of the irreversibility, the immutability of smart contracts, can be seriously problematic. There are some other problems I won't talk about today, problems like confidentiality. This is the flip side of transparency. Transparency is good, but it carries the drawback that it's inimical to privacy. It's hard to achieve confidentiality in smart contracts. Won't talk about that. Another problem that I won't talk about is the challenge of getting real-world data, integrity-protected real-world data to smart contracts. But this is just to indicate that there are a number of really interesting technical challenges, which is what makes smart contracts such fertile ground for research and makes it such an intriguing topic. But as I said, I'm going to focus today on the problem of correctness. This token mania I've described has some very interesting side effects. The smart contracts that manage tokens tend to be fairly compact. Typically, they have just a few hundred lines of code. But each of them is handling, in some cases, an immense amount of money. And consequently, the amount of monetary value attributable per line of code to these contracts is kind of eye-watering. Here's a table I compiled just a few days ago, which I believe is essentially current, showing the value per line of code for 3 well-known tokens. As you can see, their value amounts to millions of dollars per line. And in the case of EOS, to well more than $10 million a line. Of course, this is something that hackers are well aware of. These are especially appealing targets, and hackers have not been slow to take advantage of this fact. There have been a number of smart contract hacks, of which I'll mention just a few of the more infamous examples. Perhaps the most well-known example is the DAO, Distributed Autonomous Organization hack, a couple of years ago, mid-2016. The DAO was a kind of crowd-funded venture capital fund, if you will. It was also crowd-administered. The contract running the DAO, unfortunately, had a bug. It had a reentrancy vulnerability that a hacker discovered and exploited, and the hacker was able to siphon off something on the order of $50 million. This was a huge event in the world of Ethereum, because 2 years ago, it's hard to cast your mind back to this distant past, but 2 years ago, Ethereum was worth only something like $1 billion. That was its market cap. The DAO was worth on the order of 150 million. So something like 15% of the total value of Ethereum was lodged in this one smart contract. And it was brutally hacked. Last summer, a popular multisig wallet, the Parity multisig wallet, was hacked. As a result of incorrect use of a library contract. A complicated issue having to do with what's known as a delegate call, an unusual type of function call that's specific to Ethereum and Solidity, the language in which this smart contract was coded. As a result of this bug, a hacker was able to make off with on the order of $30 million. If this wasn't bad enough, the very same wallet was hacked just a few months later, and again was hacked due to a problem having to do with the way that libraries are managed. In this case, the hack was particularly interesting. The hacker didn't steal any money. The hacker killed the library contract and froze the funds in wallets dependent on this library smart contract. Those funds remain frozen and today are worth something like $250 million, so their value has risen somewhat. To give you some sense of perspective here, by the way, the biggest bank robbery in the US took place in 1997. This was the infamous Dunbar armored car robbery, where about $19 million at the time, today worth a little less than $30 million, was stolen. So these are pretty massive thefts in the grand scheme of things. And I'll have occasion to reference them again a little later in the talk. These are just the tip of the iceberg. There have been innumerable smart contract hacks, and a large fraction of the smart contracts deployed today have vulnerabilities that are more or less serious. Okay, but you may say to me, we know how to produce correct code, or at least we've got a basket of powerful techniques to do so. These include things like formal verification. We should absolutely use formal verification, right? And I think you'll hear a talk about it later today. But the problem with formal verification is twofold. The first is that it really only works well for relatively small programs. The second problem, and perhaps a more serious one, is that formal verification can't guarantee that a program is correct. It can only guarantee that it matches a specification. If that specification is itself incorrect, then the program may end up being incorrect despite your having a proof of correctness. Or, to put it another way, it sort of turtles all the way down. You've got this meta problem arising from the way that formal verification works. Alternatively, you can use popular techniques like static and dynamic verification, and again, we should absolutely, but these can only catch a limited range of bugs. They can only catch bugs whose existence you've postulated or considered beforehand, and don't address bugs of a type that you haven't yet thought of. So we perceived a need for a different technique, a need to enlarge the toolbox, as it were, to ensure smart contract correctness. And to identify a new technique, we went back to the future, as it were. Back to the 1980s, when an interesting concept known as inversion programming was popular. The goal of inversion programming was to develop highly reliable programs, in particular for embedded systems or mission-critical systems, the type of system you really don't want to fail. And it's not by coincidence, as you'll see, that I've got a picture of the space shuttle here. The idea was simple but elegant. Rather than implementing a program and just running it, what you do is code it up multiple times, ideally in different versions produced under heterogeneous circumstances, for instance, coded by different developers or produced in different high-level languages. And what you do is you execute these different versions of the program, which I'll also refer to as heads. You execute these different versions or heads in parallel. When they're given an input X, what you do is you take a majority vote over the outputs produced by the different versions. This is nice, of course, because if one of the versions turns out to be buggy, if the other two are correct, you will still get a correct output. And the hope, of course, is that the ensemble of programs here is more correct than any single one would be. One of the major contributions of the work I'm going to talk about today is taking a step back and reasoning in a principled way about what inversion programming is accomplishing. To understand what it's doing, it's helpful to have a bit of formalism. We'll refer to it as a program transformation. a procedure that takes a collection of programs, like 3 programs, all aiming to accomplish the same goal, all with the same intended functionality and interfaces, and creates a new program from them, from this ensemble, the way that n-version programming does. And I'll denote by F star the kind of meta program that this transformation is creating. Some more definitions are helpful. Let I denote the specification of an ideal program. This is a program describing exactly the functionality that the developer wants. Now, I, of course, may or may not actually be written down anywhere. It might be written down as a formal specification. It's conceptual. It's something that exists really only in the head of the developer creating a program, or the architect designing a system. Let little f denote an actual implemented, reduced to practice coded program. We define then an exploit as an input that causes the ideal program and the implemented program to produce different outputs. In other words, produces a divergence of behavior. And this is fairly intuitive. This definition should be seem fairly natural, because any deviation from intended behavior means something has gone wrong. It means there's a bug of some kind in the implemented program. And any bug, of course, can be potentially serious. I'll denote by E of Fi what I'll refer to as an exploit set, a set of inputs that cause this divergence. A concept that's going to be central here then, given this notation, is one that I'll refer to as an exploit gap, or simply a gap. Let D be a distribution, probability distribution over inputs, program inputs. The gap then for a particular transformation is defined as follows. Intuitively here, in the denominator, you have the set of exploits against the meta program, against the transformed program, or the weight, as it were, on the inputs that cause a divergence of state for this meta program from the ideal program. Okay, so this is kind of the weight of inputs that produce bugs on the transformed program. In the numerator here, you've got the set of exploits against individual programs, making up the ensemble in this meta program. So what you can see is that the bigger the gap, the better the job this transformation is doing in reducing the number of exploits. And in particular, what you really want is a gap greater than 1. Right? You want the set of exploits in the meta program to be smaller than the set of exploits covering the constituent programs, the various heads that make up this meta program. And as I said, bigger gap is desirable. The bigger the gap, the better the job that this transformation is doing in purging bugs from your program. This notion of a gap implicitly captures dependencies among the heads in your meta program. Let me give you an example. Suppose that we've got a meta program on 3 heads here, where one of the heads has a bug. Well, you can see, if we use n-version programming, that we're still going to get a correct output, given the input x that induces the bug in this one head in the ensemble. So this input x is contributing weight to the numerator. Right? It's an attack against one of the constituent programs. But it isn't an attack against the meta program. So it doesn't count in the denominator. And in that sense, it's boosting the exploit gap for the meta program. Well, the fact that one head has this bug produces an incorrect output for input x, and the others don't, means that there's some independence among heads. So independence among heads is good. It boosts the exploit gap. Well, this all sounds well and good. As I said, n-version programming is a very simple and elegant idea. But unfortunately, it didn't really seem to pan out in the 80s. As I said, to get a strong gap, you need independence among heads, or to put it another way, correlations hurt. And indeed, in the mid-'80s, an influential study by Knight and Levison, where they had a bunch of undergraduates code up some programs in Pascal and studied the bugs in the programs they produced, was confirmation that you don't have full independence among programs produced by different developers. In particular, as they put it very formally, they were able to reject the null hypothesis of full independence, at least, among the versions of the programs produced by these undergraduates. That's bad, but worse still, NASA, again, it wasn't by coincidence that I showed you Space Shuttle, NASA played with N-version programming and found that it simply wasn't cost effective. In the worst case, they were producing 3 different versions of a program, obviously a great expense, tripling the development costs, and they were only ending up with a factor 4 fewer errors in their meta program. This seems pretty damning, but an essential observation in our work is that not everything is a space shuttle. What do I mean by this? I mean that not every program needs to be available 24/7. Obviously, you do want your system to be running 24/7 if it's an embedded system in a space shuttle. But if we're talking about, say, a smart contract, it's not necessarily catastrophic if the contract goes down for a few hours or even a few days. To put it another way, there are many cases in which it's better to have no answer than to output the wrong answer, particularly if a wrong answer means that money is being stolen from a smart contract. Or, this is to say that bugs are often harmful and can be harmful, as you've seen, to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. This observation spurred us to explore a variant on N-version programming that we call N of N version programming, or NNVP. We also refer to it as the Hydra framework for reasons I'll explain in a couple of minutes. The idea behind NNVP is very simple. In N-version programming, as you'll recall, you take a majority vote over the outputs of the heads making up your meta program. In NNVP, you strengthen this module checking majority by computing majority rather, by instead checking equality. That's to say that unless all of the heads of the program agree, you abort. So you're treating divergences in state much more stringently in NNVP than you are in N-version programming. We refer to this as the Hydra framework, by the way, because these metaprograms have multiple heads, and as many of you know, the Hydra was a mythological beast that indeed had multiple heads. Well, what is this process of aborting rather than taking majority vote achieving? In effect, it's trading off availability in favor of correctness. Okay? And when we do this and revisit the Eckhart et al., the NASA experiments, we get much better numbers. We get some loss in availability, of course, right? We're aborting if an erroneous input is found, but we can achieve very large gaps. So crunching again the numbers from the Eckhart et al. Experiments, we get a gap, as you see, of over 4,000 for 3 heads and a gap of almost 35,000 for 4 heads. And in fact, these numbers are probably even better than I'm showing here because in the Eckhart et al. Experiments, they didn't distinguish between different bugs in different heads. If 2 heads have bugs, but their bugs are different, then you have independence, and that's not something they took into account in their experiments. So to sort of sum up here, this Hydra framework creates a strong exploit gap. What would formerly have been potentially a fatal vulnerability in a program is now no longer that. This vulnerability will simply cause you to abort your program, to shut down your smart contract, for instance. We took a look at some of the more famous smart contract exploits in Ethereum and found that smart contracts in particular tend to be very friendly to this Hydra framework. Which is to say that if the Hydra framework had been deployed for the contracts you see here in green and possibly the one in yellow, our belief is that it would have prevented the bugs in question. You can see, for instance, that in many cases, the vulnerabilities taken advantage of by hackers were language-based. Right? For instance, they took advantage of the gas mechanics, as they're called in Ethereum, for those who are familiar with them. So even something as simple as cross-compilation from one language to another, which wouldn't substantially increase development costs, would have prevented a lot of these exploits. Taking a step back, the main application we see for the Hydra framework in the context of smart contracts is to bug bounties. I assume most of you are familiar with bug bounties. They're a reward to a white hat hacker or gray hat hacker for responsible disclosure, typically disclosure to the vendor, of a bug, a vulnerability in software. And today, nearly every big IT firm has some kind of bug bounty program. Apple, for instance, will offer up to $200,000 for a particularly juicy exploit, like an iOS jailbreak. You can find a list of IT firms with bug bounty programs on a few different sites. BugCrowd is a particularly popular one. So bug bounties are popular. They're a pillar of the information security assurance programs of most big tech firms. But there's some problems with the way that bug bounty programs are administered today. The first is that bug bounties actually often fail to incentivize disclosure, which is, of course, the thing that they're designed to do. Why is this? Well, I mentioned that Apple will offer up to $200,000, for an iPhone jailbreak. But as a hacker, you can go to a third party like Zerodium, if you have a really good exploit, and they will pay you substantially more. Now, they'll pay you like $1.5 million for certain iPhone jailbreaks. And then, of course, they take these exploits and turn around and sell them to governments or whatever else. That doesn't matter for our purposes. The point here is that in many cases, hackers are monetarily incentivized not to disclose to the vendor. This is problem one. Problem two is that there's often a lag in time between a disclosure and some action, like a software patch on the part of the vendor. It takes time to analyze a vulnerability and to figure out how to remediate it. And in the meantime, of course, this vulnerability could be weaponized, either by the hacker or somebody else who discovers it. That's problem number two. Problem number three is that bounty administrators often just don't pay. Or they pay hackers who have dutifully reported vulnerabilities, exploits, less than they would seem to be entitled to. And this happens again and again, where hackers in good faith will report bugs and then they just don't get the bounties that they're entitled to. So if we pause for a moment and imagine what the perfect bug bounty program would look like, it would have three principal components, reflecting the flaws I've mentioned in existing programs. The first is that it would be high leverage. By this, I mean that a small bounty, $200,000, tens of thousands of dollars, would be sufficient to incentivize hackers to disclose. You don't need to pay 1.5 million or millions of dollars, even if the exploit in question has high monetary value. The second feature we would like is automatic payout. It shouldn't be a requirement that a bounty hunter need trust the bounty program administrator to pay. This should happen automatically. This would instill more trust in the hacker community and also more strongly incentivize people to look for bugs to begin with, at least the white hat hacking community. The third feature we really want is some kind of automatic response. As soon as a bug is discovered, it should be patched or dealt with in some way, so that this time lag in which bugs can be weaponized doesn't exist. Right? These are the things that we would like to have in a bug bounty program. Now let me talk about how we can achieve them using the Hydra framework, starting with high leverage. To understand leverage, it's helpful to take the perspective of an economically rational hacker or attacker. Now, suppose we've got some target program that has a monetary value A, in the sense that if you exploit this thing, you can make $A. Well, an attacker who finds an exploit has a choice. She can choose to attack the program, in which case she gets $A, or she can choose to disclose. If there's no bounty program in place, then of course disclosure results in a reward of $0. So it's pretty clear what an economically rational attacker will do. Right? She will always attack under these circumstances. In contrast, if we've got a traditional bounty program that pays B dollars, well, the choice of the attacker is again quite clear, but rather different. In this case, the attacker will disclose if the value of the bounty exceeds that of the program. If the amount that can be derived from the bounty exceeds the monetizable value of an exploited program. But as I said, what we would like is high leverage. We want a small bounty to be able to incentivize an attacker when the reward, monetary reward for an exploit is large. In other words, what we'd like is the following scenario. We would like disclosure to result in payment of a bounty, say of B dollars. We want an attack to result in, say, less than the A dollars that is the value of the program. As it should result in a payoff of something like A dollars divided by some value gap. And of course, I haven't chosen this term gap arbitrarily. Right? If we can get a gap much larger than 1 here, then we've got high leverage by definition. Right? And in this case, an adversary will disclose as long as the bounty exceeds A divided by the gap. The bigger the gap, the smaller the bounty that's required. But you may be doing a double take here. Right? I said we want to incentivize a rational attacker to disclose when the value of the bounty is less than the value of the program. Right? This would seem to contradict the very rationality of the attacker. Let me show you, though, how we can accomplish this, again, in the Hydra framework. Right? What seems at first glance impossible will make sense in a moment. So you recall, in the Hydra framework, if a collection of heads, program versions, don't agree, then we abort the execution of the meta program. If they agree, we run the program, and we produce the agreed-upon output. So if there's a bug in one of the programs, right, we terminate, and we kick over to some fault manager right, that will, as I said, abort the program and possibly do something else. This fault management process can also, in the context of a smart contract, automatically pay out a bounty. A smart contract, as I mentioned before, can manipulate money, and they have the ability to send money to people. So if a user submits an input that causes a divergence in state, or output rather, among the heads, causes the program to abort, she can be rewarded automatically with a bounty. So now, a hacker attacking a Hydra program faces a dilemma. If she's discovered a bug in one head of the program, she can monetize it immediately. Right? She can shut down the program, claim the bounty for B dollars. But alternatively, she could wait and try to claim the larger prize. In other words, she could try to find an exploit that affects all 3 heads of the program, and then claim the full value, A dollars, exploit value of the program. But there's a risk in waiting here. If the attacker waits too long, there's a chance that somebody else will discover a flaw, a bug in one of the heads of the program and claim the bounty. And then all the attacker's hard work gone into discovering this vulnerability will go out the window. The attacker can no longer claim the bounty because it will have been claimed by somebody else. So trying to break all 3 heads carries some peril at the point that you've discovered one. You've got a bird in hand and you risk it if you try to break the program as a whole. Now you recall this definition of a gap. Right? What we're able to show is the following. We do get high leverage in the following sense. Suppose we've got a very powerful adversary, an economically rational adversary that's able to find bugs in the heads of our program as fast as all honest bounty hunters combined, the rest of the community. You can consider this adversary to be an amalgamation, even, of all of the black hat hackers in the world, and our presumption is that the white and gray hats are equally powerful. We can modify this assumption. We get slightly different results, of course. Let's suppose, again, we've got a contract worth $A in terms of exploit value and a bounty of $B. What we're able to prove is that an adversary is incentivized to disclose as long as the bounty is greater than A divided by gap plus 1. So essentially, we got what we wanted. Namely, the adversary will disclose if B is greater than A divided by the gap plus this tiny constant. So we get high leverage. And this leverage, again, stems from the fact, or from this phenomenon of the bird in hand. An attacker is incentivized to disclose, unless A is huge, lest somebody else find a bug and claim the bounty first. To give you some concrete figures here, you'll recall that the Eckhart et al. Experiments implied gaps on the following order, right? Some thousands depending on the number of heads you have. So suppose we've got a smart contract worth $1 billion. An example would be the Omise Go smart contract, which as of this morning, again, things change, but as of this morning is worth about $1 billion. And suppose that we've got 4 heads in our smart contract. In this case, because we have such a large gap, it turns out that a bounty of only $30,000 will be sufficient to incentivize an adversary to disclose. And this is a pretty modest bounty. So we've achieved this property of high leverage in our perfect bug bounty program. What about the other 2 properties? What about automatic payout, for instance? Well, you'll recall that this smart contract will pay out to a user as soon as a vulnerability is discovered, right? As soon as a bad input is furnished. To put it another way, smart contracts pay automatically, or can pay automatically by their very nature. Right? We're dealing with a smart contract, so automatic payment is an automatic feature of the smart contract. We don't need to do any special work to accomplish it. It just happens, bam, as soon as a bad input is furnished. So we can tick this off. How about automatic remediation, though? And what do we do when a bug is discovered? You know, apart from just aborting, which could risk freezing the funds in the smart contract. Well, it's helpful to take a look back at those prominent vulnerabilities, exploits that I discussed in Ethereum, like the DAO. What happened after the DAO hack? Well, a very contentious fork occurred in which, on one branch of the fork, the hack was remediated. Money was returned to the users. There was another smaller fork in which the attacker got to keep the funds, but the majority of the value was returned to the victims. How about the parity multisig hack, this hack in which $30 million was stolen? Well, the $30 million remains in the hands of the attacker. In fact, the attacker was able to cash out only a tiny, tiny fraction of this money. This money remains in the hands of the attackers, but as the attack was occurring, a white hat team of vigilantes, as it were, got together and stole, as it were, the money that the attacker had not yet gotten his hands on, amounting to something like $78 million. What did they do with this money? Well, they were white hats, so of course they returned the money to the victims. And incidentally, this hack occurred at the tail end of a boot camp that our research initiative IC3 was holding. So a couple of the co-authors of the Hydra paper were part of the white hat hacking team. That's an interesting historical note. How about the third exploit I discussed, the second parity multisig hack, in which money was frozen? Well, the funds remain frozen, but there are some serious proposals on the table to remediate this hack by unfreezing the funds and returning them to the victims. You may be sensing a theme here. The point is that for financial smart contracts, at least, the obvious way to remediate is to return the money to the users that hold it in the smart contract. And this is something we can do automatically through our fault management process. And so we can tick off this third box, and we get something at least approximating the perfect bug bounty program that I described. So to summarize here, smart contracts are, in a sense, the perfect targets for bug bounty programs. As we've seen, they're highly vulnerable. Serious bugs are fairly prevalent in smart contracts, in Ethereum in particular. Smart contracts are hard to code correctly, partly because we don't have great languages. Solidity, the most popular, is very difficult to work with because the mechanics of Ethereum are complicated as well, the gas mechanics and so on and so forth. So we've got a real problem here. We have a lot of value per line of code in some of these smart contracts, the ERC20 smart contracts in particular. But this framework, I believe, is quite promising. As you've seen, when we enumerated well-known smart contract vulnerabilities, we found that many of them could have been addressed by the Hydra framework. And we can, in fact, support the three pillars of the perfect bug bounty program as I described it. There's an additional thing we can do that I didn't talk about, and this is pretty nifty. Normally, it's hard to know what the exploit value of a program is. Right? What is the monetizable value of an iPhone jailbreak? I have no idea. Right? Presumably, it's at least 1.5 million, since somebody's willing to pay that for at least an especially valuable one. But it could well be billions of dollars. It could be hundreds of millions. Nobody has any idea. In the case of a smart contract, though, you know pretty well what the exploit value is, or at least you've got a clear upper bound. You can actually just look it up. Now, if I want to know what the Omise Go smart contract is worth, I go to CoinMarketCap or some other site, and it will tell me what the market value of the tokens it manages is. Right? So, as I said, about $1 billion in the case of Omise Go. So for the very first time in this context, we have the ability to reason about bounty amounts in a principled way. And we can do this in real time. So we can actually, given an oracle, an authenticated data feed, as I said, it's somewhat problematic to build them, but assuming we have one, using an oracle, we can have a smart contract adjust its bounty in real time according to the value of the contract it's protecting. We've actually gone and implemented a Hydra program for an ERC20 contract, and we've even placed a few ether in the contract as a bounty, amounting to the princely sum of something like $1,500. So if you hack this contract, you can win 3 ether for yourself. And we're working on some other Hydra-ized, if you will, programs, like a generalization of the famous Monty Hall game. I was considering talking about a technical detail in our work known as submarine commitments, but I think given the time, I'm going to skip over that part of the talk and just wrap up here. So, let me say that if you're interested in the Hydra framework, we have a project page at thehydra.io with code to help you instrument your own Hydra, in fact, with the ERC20 Hydra contract I described, and with our technical paper, which is going to appear in Usenix Security in a couple of months, by the way. And finally, let me say that this research has happened under the rubric of the Initiative for Cryptocurrencies and Contracts, or IC3, which is a multi-faculty, we've got 16 faculty in the initiative now, multi-faculty research initiative spanning 8 different campuses in, I think, 4 different countries. One of those campuses, as it turns out, is EPFL. That's the good news. The bad news is that ETH is another. But there is a panoply of interesting projects going on at IC3, and I would encourage you to visit our homepage to discover them. Lots of stuff beyond the Hydra by the many faculty working on every layer of the blockchain stack. I'll end here. Thank you.